We should be going live any second now. Okay, I think we are live. I hope we are. So good evening. It's so nice to be together, to be able to have this conversation. We're here at Refuat HaNefesh tonight, together with Carrie Bornstein. Carrie Bornstein is the Executive Director of Mayim Chayim, Living Waters Community Mikveh and Education Center. And she also administers the mental health in the Jewish Community Facebook group, a current Schusterman Fellow who lives in Sharon, Massachusetts with her husband, Jamie, and their 3 school-age children. Carrie has recently written about some of her experiences with her children and their mental illnesses and some of the difficulties and successes that they've had as a family working together to help their children through those circumstances. So we're going to be talking tonight about what can we do as a Jewish community and Jewish day schools to better accommodate those children in our community with mental health issues. And we are very happy to have with us tonight for that conversation a friend of Carrie's, Stephanie Ives, who is the head of school of Beit Rabban, a preschool through 8th grade school in Manhattan. And she is going to help us as we're thinking about how to bring some of Carrie's experience to the real world inside of schools and thinking about how that can really work in real time in a real effective and manageable way in an actual school setting. So hopefully this will be an opportunity for a lot of engaging and important conversation about this very significant topic. Just wanted to remind everybody out there that we are looking for audience participation. So feel free to put any questions that you might have in the comments on this Facebook Live event, and they will be sent to me and we will get to them a little bit later in the conversation. And if you're interested in asking a question anonymously, you can email that question to info@refuathanefesh.org, and we will read the question and your name will not be associated with it. So I'm going to turn the floor over now to Carrie, who's going to share with us a little bit about her story and her family's story and what brings her this evening to thinking so much about these issues. Thank you, Carrie, for joining us, and please take the floor.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. This is one of these things that I never really wanted to know anything about, and here I am speaking on the topic. So I appreciate the opportunity to connect about this. So I grew up in the Jewish community. Just a little background about myself. I grew up in New York and went to, I was like the super Jew type that went to Jewish preschool and Hebrew school and camp and youth group, and camp certainly was a huge part of my world. It is still a major part of my Jewish identity. I went to Eisner Camp in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, and it wasn't until I was actually in the first cohort of DELET, Day School Leadership Through Teaching, when I became really sold on the concept of Jewish day school education. My husband and I both went to public schools ourselves and got a lot out of that experience, and we just really learned about the day school world, and we were excited about it even before we had kids. I've worked in the Jewish community for 20 years now. As you said, I'm the executive director of Mayim Chayim, which is a community mikveh and education center in the Boston area. And our goal is to be as open and inclusive and accessible and welcoming to every single person in the Jewish community. So with that all as context, I think it gives a little added flavor to why why this has all been so painful for me, for my family, to have had, we have 3 kids now, and each of them over the last year and a half, each of them has been turned away from a Jewish educational environment. Both two from camp, 2 from day school. And so this is, it never occurred to me that I would be a family that was, had kids who were struggling to try to integrate within the organized Jewish community. So, I believe that we have an obligation to do right by our Jewish community, especially people who are struggling. It's even more important. So I can share a little bit.
Yeah.
If you want
to,
we'll go there now.
Yeah, if you could share with us a
About,
little bit about what happened in
yeah,
the Jewish camp and Jewish school that made it, brought us to the situation where you felt that your kids couldn't continue there.
sure. So, I want to share. I want to start by sharing. I know this topic tonight is specifically focusing on day school, so I'll focus more on that piece of the conversation. But I want to start with what went well, and what really worked and what felt very good to us as a family. We developed a really solid relationship with the school counselor. It's somebody who would take our calls, whenever. She always made time for us, and became a real source of support, not only to our kids, but to us as parents, but on both levels. That relationship was really important, and the fact that a school counselor even existed, I know, is not a given, and so that was really important. We were connected with crisis intervention services that we had no idea about beforehand, and so that connection was really important. And I think we had seen certainly a good level of flexibility with one of our children's schedule at schools, post hospitalization, trying to ease her back in and give a long runway, and really making a good effort to try to make it work with her. And so those things all were really important, and really positive. And there are things that I wish would have been different, that I wish could have gone differently. I'll give a couple of examples of those things. I came to understand that I think the lens through which my children were seen was first and foremost through their struggles. And I wish there could have been more of a greater holistic picture of my kids. And to the extent that I think that made things extra challenging for them. And the things that I'm sharing here, I speak to specifically because of my experience, but also because I think they're representative of, I don't think it's so specific. I mean, people, there are people here, there are people showing up and listening to this and paying attention. I don't really care so much about my story, right? You might care, but I think there's something that's universal about this, which is what makes it important, and that there's something to learn beyond this. So I think, my kids are an example, but I think it happens beyond as well, where there are a lot of assumptions made about diagnoses, about behaviors, about what's going to happen. And in many respects, that's well-founded, right? Like there's scary stuff going on here. And it's a tremendous responsibility to care for the health and safety of our children. And I think it's important to interrogate those assumptions to really uncover what's real and what might be an assumption. And I think that the third thing that I think could be different is a greater sense of communication with parents, joint decision making, and partnership to really work together to make decisions with parental input and parental voice. And all of this, I really believe, yes, it benefits our family. All of those things that I said that went well and were good, that benefits our family personally, certainly, and it benefits the community as a whole. It's I believe that a school, a camp, a synagogue will be better off when there are people from a whole host of diverse backgrounds, including mental illnesses, including disabilities of various sorts, including a whole host of just different types of people. My organization, Mayim Chaim, is a community organization that brings together people from all different walks of the Jewish community. And I just believe that we are so much better off when we can have diversity, whatever that looks like for our different communities. There's differences of a million different kinds. And I think that really benefits everyone as a result. Yeah, so I mean, I think we're moving into a rough winter. This is only going to get worse from here. I'm not typically a doomsday kind of gal, but we're moving into some rough times here, and I believe our communities can make a difference. I'm hoping that everyone on this call tonight can latch onto one idea, big or small, something that they can do to take action on this sometime in the next week, so that we can really care for our community.
Right. So, one thing that's struck me during all the time that we've been speaking over the last number of weeks in preparation for this is that despite the fact that your family had a pretty, tough go of it in terms of camp and school and ending up with your kids no longer being there, that your interest in this discussion has always been to try and lend positively to the Jewish community as a whole, and thinking about, what are things that can be done differently, and how can these things be set up better so that it doesn't have to happen in a way that leads to this result in the end the next time. So I think it's important for us to kind of turn and take some stock of what some of those real action steps can be, because you spoke about 3 ideas in terms of you'll help me if I'm not getting all 3 of them, but and I'll go backwards. It'll be easier for me that way, in terms of, collaboration between school and parents and making decisions jointly, in terms of being able to see, that's number 1. Number 2, and again, that was number 3, but number 2, which remains number 2 in the middle, is, having a view of a child as a whole child, and not identifying or having most of what gets thought and talked about this child be whatever is that's making them difficult or challenging at this particular time. And what was the first thing again? I'm sorry.
I mean, I think that those things are related, assumptions about
right.
Yeah.
And kind of breaking down the
Assumptions about
assumptions that we have about kids. We kind of hear mental illness, residential treatment facility, short-term hospitalization, and this can trigger a lot of assumptions about what's going to be going on with this child, and some of the things that might be, I think you used the word frightening before, frightening in taking the responsibility for having that child in your building. So one thing that I've always felt is very important dealing with any kind of issues, and I'll just say this for those in the audience who might not know, I'm here tonight as the Executive Director of Refuat HaNefesh and facilitating this conversation. I've also been, a professional working in schools for, more than 20 years. So I also have a view of this this issue from a school perspective. And one thing that I've always thought is very important is that if we address any problem in the heat of it, it's going to be a lot worse and a lot less well handled than if we think about how to handle that problem in advance. And even if when we get into the heat of it, it doesn't go exactly as we planned, the fact that we had thought out some ideas about how to deal with that in advance really makes a difference once we get into the thick of things. So that may no longer be exactly the option for you and your family, but for schools in general, that's something that we can really be thinking about. So how to take these ideas and try and make them a little bit more real. So let's try and get down into that a little bit and talk with Stephanie in terms of school. One of the things that is very difficult is that the school professionals are not trained necessarily in the area of mental health. They are teachers of a variety of different subjects and coming with a variety of backgrounds, but rarely trained in mental health areas. So it's not uncommon that when confronting something new and confronting something a little bit different and outside of their comfort zone, it's scary and it's difficult. And them feeling that way and having all of these assumptions about what a child with a mental illness is like is very difficult and distressing for the family of that child. So how do we kind of bridge that gap in how we're working with our faculties and people inside of our school buildings to be a little bit more prepared to view this child with a mental illness not as a mental illness, but with a child who happens to have a mental illness?
Thank you for that question. And I actually can, if I could just take a step back before I respond, and I will respond. Unlike the presidential debates, I will actually answer the question that you
Okay.
asked.
But like the second one, I do have a mute button, so just keep that in mind.
No, I first just wanted to say that I am acutely aware, being on this call, that I am involved in a lot of people's lives, right? Every day school leader is. And there's no doubt that decisions I have made and paths I've taken have caused people pain, children and adults, their parents alike. And so I'm just thinking, as I'm about to answer this question, what it might feel like to be a parent listening to this who may have been on the other end of a decision that was painful to them in relationship with me. So I guess I just want to start by saying I apologize for all the wrong decisions I make to whoever's listening. And I'm not professing to know what to do right. And I just really hope that with each conversation like this, with each opportunity to engage with a child with special needs, mental health needs, otherwise, that we learn and get better. So I kind of want to name that to begin with. Okay, so to answer your question about teachers not being, trained mental health professionals, this is entirely true. Teachers are also not EMTs, and they are not trained in a therapist. They're not trained in a whole bunch of ways, but we don't teach curriculum, right? We teach children. And children are human beings. So, most schools, whether you're progressive or not at this point, talk about teaching a whole child, right? Like everyone believes in that. We don't always hit the mark on every front, but everyone believes in that. And a whole child is not just, making sure you hit the emotional side and the academic side. It means looking at a human being and trying to teach that human being and hold that human being. And I really, I believe nobody is well trained for that, right? Like you have to have as many tools as you can in your toolbox, and then also look at the human being in front of you and constantly be thinking about how is this going to be a safe environment for them? How is this going to be an environment where they feel loved and they feel held? And that is extremely hard to do when you're trying to meet certain curricular goals, when it's not one child, but 10 or 20, and when somebody's in crisis. And it's, I think it's particularly difficult when the kind of crisis a child is in is like sort of borderline, mental health, behavioral. You're not sure yet what's happening, but it's definitely making it really hard to manage a classroom, right? So that gets really challenging. But I guess, look, I think there was a time not too long ago where a lot of teachers would say, I can't teach a child with a language-based learning disability. They need to be in a special school, right? And I think now, I look at my teachers, so many of and we are not a school that's a language-based learning disability school, right? Or a special needs school. But, before someone gets counseled out, or before we have, I hate that phrase actually, before we have those sorts of conversations with parents that get to the place of, okay, well, there are these schools, and thank God there are in the Jewish community now. We have so many tools because so many of our teachers have a master's in special ed. So we have ongoing professional development and differentiating for different kinds of learners. It's just been accepted that people learn in different ways. I think there was a time where that wasn't the case and you had to be a cookie cutter like that. And I really hope we get to a place where it's so part of what it means to be a Jewish day school teacher to like also have ongoing training on what it means to teach and hold a child who's struggling with this sort of mental health issue or that, or how do you notice when there's signs? How do you take I'm thinking about, like, this is not the right parallel, but we've been doing a whole bunch of training on child safety from the perspective of sexual abuse and other abuse, and we do a lot of not only what are the indicators, but how do you take a disclosure, right, of abuse. So also with mental health, there's a sense of somebody may be trying to tell you something that you may not even notice. Maybe you're the first person who's getting that disclosure, right? So that kind of training, we're not doing. And I gotta believe the resources exist in the Jewish community, but it's definitely not it's definitely not in the water the way that, thank God, other things have become in the water, that we recognize, we're teaching whole people who have experiences that are not just, you cannot control, right? Their entire internal state, their brain chemistry and every experience they have, and you still have them in your community.
Right. Absolutely. So, I think that I'm hearing you say that, as difficult as it can be for a teacher to be everything, in terms of, being able to handle all problems that come up with any child. The fact of the matter is that if we are teaching children and we are caring for children in our buildings during the time that they're with us, that entails caring for them in their entirety. And every child, when looked at in its entirety, is going to have things which are different about them. And as much as that's difficult, we have to find the ways to do that. And it seems like you're suggesting that if the communal conversation shifts, then it will become more of an emphasis within the proactive education of teachers that we do to be aware of these things. And, to me, it really feels familiar in terms of what happened in my own school in terms of diabetes, right? We had some students who were diabetic. And because of that, there was a real push to get training in that area. And it's now become, something that originally the parent of that child was coming in and saying, let me talk to the teachers and explain to them, how to react to seeing certain signs, to something which is, we don't even think about anymore. It's just on our checklist of our, August professional development. Do we got the diabetes training in there? Yep, we got the diabetes training in there. And it becomes just part of the conversation. And there's no question in my mind.
And you're not doctors. It's not like your teachers are trained to be. I don't mean
right,
to.
Right. And there's no question. I had an experience myself where, one of the children, he was probably 15 or whatever, but one of the kids, with diabetes, we were on a trip and was having a difficulty. And I kind of snapped into a certain mode and knew what to do, and called to somebody and had them drive ahead with supplies that he needed, etc. And because I was called by a teacher who was on the spot, who was noticing certain things, and it just sort of it just sort of happened naturally, because for 4 or 5 years we've been talking about it without incident. And then when something did happen, there was a certain amount of preparedness for it.
No, can I sort of point something at Carrie and at you? Because I sort of see 3 areas in which it's like hard for schools or for me, for our teachers, et cetera, to wrap their minds around supporting kids with mental health. First of all, we don't, like, frankly, we don't have the resources internally. Like we have a social worker who's remarkable and has done actually lots of counseling. She was a clinical social worker, but she oversees all special needs, right? She oversees all student services. So she oversees the learning specialist and the this and the that, right? And so there's that piece, there's the resources. But I think a couple other things are, one is it's really scary to have something you don't know, and even if you do know, I mean, like we talk about it like, oh, this child has a mental health issue, as if like, half of our teachers and administrators aren't medicated themselves, right? Or as if like we haven't all had ourselves or family member who's had a mental health crisis. Like it's not like you see a child with a mental health crisis and you're like, I've never seen this before. But there's something of like, I don't know what's going on with this child, and a fear that if something happens to this child, it's going to be on me. So there's that piece. There's the piece of like when a child's in crisis and it's sort of destroying a class, that's not every child who has a mental health issue. For some kids, it's not even surfacing in school, right? But sometimes it becomes a real behavioral issue, especially if not properly diagnosed, not properly medicated, et cetera. And then I think there's this other totally different thing, which is we're not like they're not keeping up. We're not teaching, and they're not getting this, that, or whatever because they're not in class that much. And can we serve them according to our curriculum? So I see those like as three things that actually are, I don't know, like stumbling blocks in terms of supporting children. Carrie?
Yeah, Carrie.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate so much of what you're saying. And, I want to pick up on one of the pieces that you talked about, as if half of our teachers and administrators don't have these things themselves, right, or loved ones. And I actually think that's precisely like part of what the training that doesn't exist right now, and that's not present the way it should be, is actually to deal with exactly that, right? Because I think that it's actually because of those connections and associations that people have that facilitates some of those assumptions being made and projections about what's going on with the kid, because oh, this kid has insert what self-harm, eating disorder, whatever the thing is. My sister went through the same thing. And so like I think it can be, very understanding, like to trigger the teachers and the administrators, and now you've got people distracted with their own stuff and laying onto the kids in front of them what happened to their sister 30 years ago that they're now assuming is the same thing happening with this kid. And it's like, there's way too much filter that's going through there. So I think it's a really important piece of this.
Right. I think that's a really interesting issue that you raise. I think that certainly it's true that almost any time we see something that kind of scratches the surface of our safe assumptions about the world, it brings up all kinds of fears internally. And on the one hand, we really don't want people projecting what's going on with them, to the child or the family that they're dealing with. But on the other hand, if it becomes comfortable to talk about, so then it becomes easier not to have to. In other words, if I can talk comfortably about the fact that I'm in therapy or that I'm on antidepressant and anti-anxiety medication, around the water cooler, one day we'll be allowed to be around water coolers together again, right? So, if I can do that comfortably, so then it doesn't have to come out in that particular conversation when I get triggered by it. And, it's certainly come up for me in sort of a, almost, looking back at the tragically unfortunate kind of way. I told you guys before this conversation, I was going to throw in some shameless plugs. So for Refuah Nefesh program, so, we have a page on the Refuah Nefesh website called We Are Not Ashamed, where people can post their profiles indicating, what mental health issues they've had, what mental health services they've engaged in, so that people can look at it and say, oh, totally normal people like Noam Stein are on that page. So, it's not something that should be so difficult to talk about. But for years, I've been talking to students and their parents and other people in the school about their mental health needs, and talking about, well, my experience tells me that sometimes when people shift medications, it takes a certain amount of time to get used to that medication shift. And, meanwhile, I'm really talking about myself, and I'm not disclosing that. And, a burden has sort of been lifted by, now I have a place where I can talk about that. I mean, to the extent that we had a program in school we wanted to bring in an expert psychologist from, and I recommended this woman to come and speak and run sessions in the school, right? And it's like, how do you know about this wonderful psychologist, right? I didn't tell anybody that, well, she's my therapist. That's all I know about, right? So I think normalizing these conversations, even within schools, can really make a very big difference. And, some of the things that schools are doing right now, which really could be a shift around this. And I know that, for instance, our federation here in Detroit is offering this to schools, is recognizing, well, if we've ever seen a time when we recognize that teachers and administration within schools have their own mental health needs that need to be addressed, this is that time, right? And we're being offered, services by our federation to help our teachers be able to manage that, because everybody's recognizing right now this may be the time when we can kind of, break that cycle and make these things that we can talk about. I want to go to some questions that did come in from the audience, and they're very relevant to exactly what we're talking about now, so they're not going to take us off track. But if I could just for a moment take a commercial break, just for people out there watching, so I did want to mention that, Refuat HaNefesh is running a program unrelated to this program that I just wanted to make people aware of. You might be aware of it already because we've been posting about it like crazy, but there are a lot of reasons why in this pandemic reality that we're all living in, people are having specific difficulties, stressors, distress, anxiety, heightened levels of sadness and loneliness and isolation and all kinds of things. And we at Refuat HaNefesh are doing our small part to try and address that. We've run some programs in a few shuls and our Coming Out of COVID Complete series. And coupled with that, we have support groups, which are starting next week. They're free online support groups. They're maximum of 10 people. People have already begun to sign up. So if you are interested in them, I urge you to take a look at them and sign up. I'll just put the flyer up here on the screen for a second for what we're looking at our own selves here. But here's the flyer. We have 4 different support groups. One is for older adults 55 and older who are experiencing isolation and loneliness. One is for younger adults 18 and over who are experiencing isolation and loneliness. And one is for those who have experienced grief and loss. And that doesn't have to be somebody who passed away, unfortunately, due to COVID, but we know that a lot of people, because of the pandemic, their normal grieving process was interrupted in certain kinds of ways, not having the same access to support and friends, Shiva that took place over Zoom, funerals that were live streamed, that kind of thing, which could be very difficult. And here, something very related to what we're talking about is parents of children with specialized needs can be feeling a special sense of pressure and difficulty above and beyond what all parents are feeling at this time, because of all kinds of things that happened in the pandemic that made that more difficult. So I'll ask Eitan to please put the link to the form that you can sign up into the comments on the Facebook page. And if anybody will find these support groups helpful for themselves or wants to pass them along to others, that'd be great. Okay, commercial over. I'll now turn to a question here that I think is very important. It's from Sue Fendrick, and she said that Jewish day schools often have to say to families that they can't accommodate their child with learning issues past a certain level. And learning issues, that's their wheelhouse, as Sue put it. What will it take for day schools do A, B, and B feel actually ready to embrace students with a wider range of mental health needs? What kind of things do we need to put into place in our schools in order to really be able to do that? And, Stephanie, you mentioned that, your school social worker is playing a multiplicity of roles and is not completely dedicated to mental health needs, per se. So what will it take for schools to be ready? And I want to take Sue's question a little bit and, mix it together with Ariel Morkwitz's question, which is, what kind of larger community resources beyond the school? Because we can't put the whole thing on Beit Rabban. What kind of things can we look to the organized Jewish community in a wider sense to help provide to schools? Like, what would be your wish list if you could get them from the wider Jewish community to help have these things available within schools?
My favorite thing on earth is wish lists, so I love this question. Also, let me just say that if I ask for something and someone hears it and says, "Oh my God, you're such an idiot, that already exists," well, great, please tell me about it, because that would be the best. Okay. That would be the best outcome. So let's start with this. Yes, it would be really amazing if we could have a philanthropic investment to bolster student support services in Jewish day schools. In general, we're a small school, and there's tremendous benefits of small school. I'm a huge believer. I also think there's big benefits to a big school, and some types of resources are a little harder in smaller schools. But the truth is, if you have a strong team of counselors in a larger school, like, their caseloads are probably pretty heavy as well. So I think a philanthropic investment in these positions would be huge. To seriously use this time right now to focus on destigmatizing mental health. The anxiety and stress, this is just in the water right now, right? So this is a great opportunity to destigmatize therapy, even medication, etc., and to also create opportunities to support Jewish educators in particular, because, and I wrote about this with some of my colleagues over the summer, these are Jewish essential workers right now, right? It's one of the first groups of Jewish communal professionals who have gone back to work, of course, rabbis and people who work in senior care and stuff like that. So I think that would be really amazing. I just wish, I am constantly finding myself in a situation where, whether it's a learning issue or a mental health issue, and frankly, the intersection of the two is a place where I'm finding myself particularly wishing that parents had more resources, and that I had more resources for people who have less financial resources. Because sometimes when a child's in crisis and you want to keep them in school and you don't want to upend their life as you're trying to figure things out, you actually just need another set of hands with that kid. And that is a very, very, very expensive thing to get. It is super hard to get that, even in a city like New York City. It's super hard to get that through the Department of Education, et cetera. And it can really help a kid not sort of fall out of basic functioning in school. I know that's it's a really small thing, right? To say, but I wish that I had a number I could call to say, we have a family who's in crisis. They have a child in crisis. It's an intersection of mental health, learning, whatever it is. We need some stopgap resources. We don't have them. Can you support us? Can you support this family? That would be tremendously valuable. Of course, professional development, but as a less in terms of how, nobody needs to be trained on how to be a therapist, right? That's not the training that the teachers need. But training in how to notice, how to react, how to respond, how to, frankly, how to modify a lot of things for different kinds of mental health needs.
Can I
Okay,
want to
so-
add one piece about what I think it will take to change things that we haven't talked about yet, which is giving voice to parents and even kids who are the greatest experts there are, right? A lot of the solutions here will cost a lot of money. There's no doubt. I love that stopgap hotline that we're going to call, Stephanie, when, someday, right? I love that.
Noam's going to open that after this.
Amazing. Thank you, Noam.
Throw money at
As
him.
soon as I
Really,
get the
yes.
grant. Foundations, please call me.
Yeah. I love that. And I mean, what would it look like if we actually created groups in each school of parents who know one another, or maybe community wide, right? That spans different, it spans a particular day school, where parents can first of all support each other and know what each other are dealing with and going through. And what if the school was actually listening to parts of it, whether they're sitting on the committee or there's just communication back and forth, right? Like, I think there's a situation where there's like such a disconnect between the parents who know exactly what this looks like on the ground. And, there are plenty of times when the parents are bumbling through it all themselves and like have no idea what to do with their kids. And there are times where they know, like, okay, we know how to deal with this. We know what this looks like. We know what to do. And it doesn't take necessarily professional development training coming in and being with all the teachers, which, by the way, needs to completely be mandatory when it does happen. I just want to like put that in there as well. That like the people who volunteer to come to these things are probably not the ones who need it most. But the parents who are dealing with this and who know about this can communicate with the teachers who are saying, what would we ever do? How would we know, right? Like, let's actually talk to the people who are central to dealing with these issues, and to kids who could even share their stories as well, right? Like, we actually know a lot. I think we have a lot available at our fingertips that we're not yet accessing.
Yeah, it requires a basis of a trust relationship, which, helps on every front. This is on every front.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we
That's
can invest
something-
in those before crisis happens. Yeah.
Yeah, well, exactly. I think that's so important, is the idea of creating those trust relationships in advance. I mean, something that, I wrote about on Facebook and promoting this is that, from my experience within schools, more often than is necessary, there's kind of a feeling among parents that, well, we would know all of this stuff about our kids and the school doesn't want to listen. And then there's a feeling among people in schools of, we really know what's going on because, you may know what's going on with your, 14-year-old, but I've seen 500 14-year-olds. And what you're suggesting is just not realistic. And they're kind of dismissing one another automatically. For me, one of the most helpful things and kind of moving past that, I'm not saying I've moved past it entirely, is having kids come to the age that I was teaching. I'm working in high schools virtually my entire career. So it took a while until my own children got to that age, right? But then once I'm, at that age where I'm hearing from my child and my wife and myself as a principal and the teacher who's talking all about what's going on with his own child, you realize that all of these perspectives are very valuable and none of them should be dismissed. But it's very hard to get to that point. And the only way to do it is to set up those conversations before there's a crisis, right? To kind of come in and say, okay, this, my child's, coming back from a residential facility center. Here's what you need to do for them when you haven't had conversations before where everybody feels like they're working together because they care about this child is very difficult. Let me take the conversation in a different direction. So, your children, Carrie, were ultimately not able to be served by the school that they were in. And the question, one thing that you've mentioned to me when we've talked before is that you think it's really important, and I agree with this, for schools to communicate really clearly, like your organization, Mayim Chaim, does, that inclusion of all types of people is the starting point, the default position, and matters. And like Stephanie was talking about, that, it's not about including children with mental illnesses. It's about including children. Some of them have mental illnesses, some of them have physical illnesses, some of them read faster, some of them read slower. And it's about
Some of them
including
develop
both.
these things after you've already, like, they evolve like humans, right?
Right, right. So, but, with all of that being said, there comes a time when, or does there for you come a time when a school is just not the right environment for a particular child, because that particular child's needs can't be well met in the school. And, what are ways that that message could have been communicated to you and your family, which would have felt affirming rather than dismissing?
So, yeah, so listen, I actually, I think there certainly will be times where not every child can be served by every school, right? At least, probably not in our lifetime. There will be times, I think, where a child will not be able to continue in a school. And I want to say two things. The first thing I want to say is that I want schools to be in partnership and conversation with that family, so that it's, and if it is a one-sided decision, to own the fact that it is a one-sided decision, right? It's for a school to say, we want what's best for your child. I think they want what's best for their school. That's first and foremost. The mission is for the school. The mission is not for a particular family. And to really truly want what's best for a child has to factor in the millions of different factors that exist for what goes on in that child's life. I think that the only thing that a school can really speak to is its educational environment. It just can't speak to the rest of a child's world and what is best for that child, big picture. So that's one thing I want to say. When a child does need to be dismissed, dismiss with dignity. It will happen. I want schools to exhaust every other possible option before dismissing a child. And if it has to happen, to hand that family off to someone else in the community who can shepherd them through, so that there's literally it's passing a baton. Not that I want to be on an assembly line myself, but I want schools to see themselves as being, these institutions represent the community writ large. This is not just, we're so sorry we can't have you at our particular school. This is now a turning away from the Jewish community as a whole. And that is a massive responsibility. And I don't think that anyone takes that lightly. I think that our schools are, the missions that they are looking to achieve are just too important. No one's being flip about this. I understand. And I'm glad I'm not on the other side of that myself. It's got to be excruciating. And I think that there's, it has to be done as an absolute last resort in partnership with a family to be able to say, we don't know, we think that we are not the best educational environment for your child. Here's why. Here are the concerns that we have. what are your concerns? Maybe we can come to some agreement together. Maybe there is a way that we can salvage this. What would it look like if we were to be successful? And to explore that every single possible option before making that decision. And when it is made, to have a caring, loving handoff to someone else in the Jewish community who can be a better fit.
Right. So I apologize, I was turning this way, but I'm just reading some of the questions that are coming in. And one of them I think is, I would almost say less of a question and more of a suggestion along the lines of some of what you're talking about now, in terms of, in other words, you phrased it in terms of when a school decides that this child doesn't belong in this school anymore. And we'll talk about that difficult circumstance where it is, let's say, one-sided. I'll just take a little bit of a detour and say that, I do think that if we've properly set up the relationship between the school and the family as the situation has unfolded, that under most circumstances, the family and the school can come to a joint decision, because I do know that sometimes it feels like the school is looking out for the institution, but and maybe this will be a point of disagreement, but from my perspective with my colleagues around the world, most of them are only in schools because they care tremendously about children. So they do what's best for each child. They're sometimes not sure if they can help child B while still trying to help child A. And that's a difficult circumstance. But that was my little diversion. Getting back to the point is that, you said that it really represents a turning the child away from the kind of entire Jewish, institutional community, and that's a huge responsibility. So this person asked, can we also address the challenge of having Jewish institutions be in the tough position of actually not be the best place for a particular child? But when that might happen, how do we as a community and as institutions maintain connections and assert our commitments to communal inclusions for this family, right? In other words, they're asking the question both from the perspective of the institution, doing what's right, but also when the parent might decide that the right thing to do is to take my child out, can the institutions be still extending an open hand and say, you might take your child out, but you can still be involved in X, Y, and Z way, so that if you think it's right to take your child out, you don't have to feel like that means remove my child entirely from the Jewish community or keep them in the school. If taking them out of the school is right, are there other ways to keep the child involved? And I guess I would ask, you, Carrie, what are some things that might have been, those kinds of outreaches to you as you were taking your children out that would have been meaningful? Would you have been open to maintaining those other kinds of connections? And maybe Stephanie, what you think as a school, you might be able to offer in that kind of regard to keep children involved.
Yeah, I mean, I think I will like Stephanie answer the question. But I think that there's a greater question here about whether or not a school is a community in the way that something like a synagogue is a community. And I think that there may be a conflation of these two things that feels that it adds to the complication, right? Like, if I am a member of a synagogue, do people get kicked out of synagogue memberships? I don't know. It probably happens because Jews. I don't know. But I think that there's a baseline assumption when families are part of a synagogue community that they're just part of it. Like, people might be less engaged, more engaged, but they're always a part of things. Schools are different. I suspect that they are, some really are true communities like that, but you do need to enroll in a school and opt into it or be accepted into it. I mean, actually, like, Jewish day schools have admissions, right? Like you have to be accepted, which means you can be dismissed. And so I just think that that's an important layer, like that I would want schools to clarify and maybe not throw around the word community
Unless
without
they mean it.
unless they mean it, right? And that's kind of what I think is important about this topic as a whole, right? Is if you are not a school for everyone, don't say it, right? Like I want schools to be honest about who they are for and who they serve, and who they don't. And I think that that's okay.
I don't think people,
But
I mean, I think part of that is it's super hard to be honest with yourself. Like, right, like to, as a school to say, something that's very painful in what the language of like, your child, it's your child isn't best served here. This is not in the best interest of your child. It sort of puts it on the child who's the problem. And I feel,
yes,
I'm hoping I never said that. And I wonder if I have, because every time we can't serve a child, I'm pretty confident it's our fault. And look, fault, not fault, like we can't be everything to everybody, and all that is true, but I can't feel good about that ever, or feel like it's the child who's the problem. The child is a little Jewish human who should be part of
Right.
it.
I mean, in some kind of ideal world, right, a Jewish community would be an absolutely full service community, and it would have every type of service in school or within a school, every type of service that there could possibly be. So I don't know if I completely am on board with the fault language, right? But the fact that our Jewish community does not have the services that your child needs does mean that our Jewish community does not have all of the services to service all of the people in our community. And that is something lacking. I'd use that word.
That is something lacking. That is a much better word than fault.
Yeah. So, because there are all kinds of factors that are out of your hands and my hands that make it so that we're lacking this. I think one big question to ask is, and this goes back to some of the earlier conversation, is why is it that, communities aren't lacking a bagel store, but are lacking services for children with mental health issues? And I'm not trying to be flip about it, but I think that the agenda that we as the community set as the things that you'd better take care of ends up having an influence on where, the fungible money which is involved in the community gets placed. And the priorities that get set from the top and from the bottom, influence those larger community decisions. But I would like to go back to this point that the person asking the question or making the comment was making, is that I think maybe I'm optimistic, but I feel like it's possible. Again, I go back to the fact that I feel like it's possible for it to almost always feel like a joint decision if the discussions all along have been the caring kinds of conversations where it's clear that what matters is our care for this child and maintaining this relationship. But like I know in our school, and issues unrelated to this, that we've had children who've decided, or their parents have decided, not to continue coming to our school. And we've tried really hard to say, oh, well, we have a Mishmar program on Thursday nights for extra learning, which is kind of open to the public. Please keep coming to that program, or being excited when they do come to that program, and things like that. But on the flip side, when we've had a student who left the school because after 8th grade, it was clear that his learning disabilities were were just more than we had in our array of services to be able to service within our school. And he did do better in a special education environment in a public school. And then his parents were interested in him joining us on our school Shabbaton, right? That became a very difficult decision for us to think about, because that wasn't an open program. That was us taking a lot of responsibility for a student who wasn't fully here. So where that line of what kinds of ways there can be outreach and what kind of ways we have to say, no, this is for people who are in the school and this is for people who aren't, is definitely complex. I'll throw in one more point about that issue that you raised about community, Carrie, is that I think it's very different in different types of communities. When you have a, one school town, right, the way in which that school is the center of the community is different than when you have Jewish communities where there's school choice.
Right.
So that's really different in different parts of the country and the world.
Right.
Okay, should we go to a totally different question from Anonymous here? Carrie, have you encountered any pushback in the community for shining a light on this problem we have in the Jewish day school system, who prefer perhaps you didn't bring our schools bad publicly?
I have to say, I haven't. And I was, I thought about that a lot, and I've been really, honestly, wonderfully blown away by, I've had people reaching out to me from community organizations, from our federation and CJP, wanting to meet with me, wanting to have conversations, right? Like, best case scenario. I mean, and listen, like, thanks entirely to, by the way, to my 13-year-old daughter, who is, she doesn't know all of the details about what I'm doing and saying, but she doesn't feel big stigma or shame about the fact that she was in the hospital. She just doesn't. She's okay with it. She's okay. I had a friend who was looking to interview teens who had been struggling with mental health stuff during the pandemic, and would she talk to her and, on the record and be published? She was like, yeah, well, I don't, sure. And so it's because of my daughter, like, that I'm able to take her lead and say, she's okay with my, she doesn't have a problem with anybody knowing. So that's like a huge blessing that she gives me. And when I say, like, including all of these kids in our Jewish community, like, she is a member of our Jewish community, and I am able to grow because of her. And so, I mean, when I thought about speaking about this, and like what my goal was and what my best case scenario was, like, this is it, that people are paying attention and listening, and I, hopefully I've handled it well. I've put a lot of thought into how to do this in a way that's constructive and helpful towards the goals that I'm trying to achieve. And I'm sure that I've screwed up places along the way. And ultimately, I've it's been my goal to call in rather than call out. And from what I've seen, it seems like that's happening. So I'm very, I'm very grateful that I have not received that pushback.
Right.
No,
Maybe I'll
can
leave
I
it now.
jump in
Yeah.
for a second?
Yeah.
I really, having, known Carrie's family since before there were little Kinderlach, and having the blessing of watching your family grow, I don't think it is by chance that your daughter doesn't have a ton of stigma around this. You guys were doing work around destigmatizing mental health before she could really speak.
Yeah.
And it's really, actually, I'm just, as I'm listening to you say that, I'm thinking that's a really important lesson here for every parent, because you never know what's coming down the pike. We already know that. So to the degree you could destigmatize whatever is coming down the pike, it's probably going to be a lot better for your kid.
Right. I think that can be a model for our schools also, not just for parents, right? Is that if we're able to have open conversations about difficult topics from an early, stage, doesn't have to be age, but I mean, way before any issue arises, and that goes from, us initiating those conversations at the developmentally right place to also, working with teachers to be open to, hearing tough questions and or comments or revelations, and to, handle them in a way that doesn't make the young person who raised them shut down. I know that that's, always a challenge with my own children at home. It's not so much of a challenge for me in high school, because by the time they're in high school, they're saying everything and everything from day one. So, it's, you're used to that already. But, my younger children would sometimes, just, say something out of the blue, and, can kind of want to be able to, internalize that idea that, they're going to see that reaction on your face. And if the reaction says, why the heck did you say that? Then they're not going to say it next time. And that's pretty dangerous.
Right.
And if your reaction says, this is a horrible, scary thing, I can't believe you brought it up. So they're going to be scared to say it the next time. And working on those things are very important. So I'll turn.
Children test the waters, right? Like all human beings, but they really test
Yeah.
the waters. So if they have something important to tell you, they may not realize that they are hinting it at you, but they are hinting.
Right.
You get to see your reaction.
Right.
So
Yeah. So that's in schools also, and with parents also. I'd say the school's reaction to the parents. If when a parent calls and says my kid's having difficulty in math class and they feel shut out, then they're not going to tell you when their kid is.
Yeah.
They're going to say that my kid needs to take a few weeks off because they're not feeling well, and leave the school out. Well, what's going on, right? Because they don't trust you. So that's important for us as school professionals in the way that we're, interacting with parents. And on the flip side, I always urge parents to be, to be open about these things. I've had the unfortunate experience of seeing, parents, let's say, send their kids off to a gap year in Israel and not share with the institution, some of the real mental health struggles that their kid has gone through. And I've tried to warn parents. I said, don't be worried about the stigma. You need to make sure services are set up in advance. I think we'll turn to the last set of questions, and kind of coming off this issue of, being able to talk openly about difficult things. And I see there are a few more questions, but I think just for time, we'll have to close out with these questions. These are really, really heady and difficult topics, and we're talking about destigmatization, and we're talking about destigmatization for adults in the community. And then, we have the challenge, either as school professionals or as parents, about talking to these things to very young kids, right? So how do we talk to 11-year-olds about things like eating disorders, self-harm, suicidality, things like that, in a way that's developmentally, safe for them to talk about those things? And I always think about the fact that when you talk about 11-year-olds, you have 11-year-olds who are 16-year-olds, and you have 11-year-olds who are 8-year-olds, and they're in the same class together, right? How do you have that conversation there?
Yeah.
And then Ariel Mintz, who I have to ask his questions since he's the chairman of the board. He asked a few questions, but I'm only taking one of your questions, Ariel. So the flip side is that, Carrie having conversations with your kids at home, but he wants to know not about the discussions about mental health, but the discussion about your kids being told that they couldn't come back to school. How did you have your conversation with your kids about that in a healthy and safe way for them to hear that? So
Sure.
those are the two last ones we'll end with.
Yeah. So I'll speak to that one. So with our daughter, she actually, there was something similar with both of our kids, where we sort of were able to finagle things so they thought it was their idea, which was quite nice. With my daughter, she really, she knew it wasn't working. She was having a very, very hard time, and she just, she didn't have it in her at the end to keep trying. And I think with her, it was about helping her understand that it didn't have to feel like that. It didn't have to be that way. She didn't have to struggle in a school and feel like a failure every day and have to come home early because she couldn't stay there, right? Like that we would find her a place where she would be accepted for who she was and supported. And that, I mean, listen, that was last February. And then the pandemic, right? So she actually was waiting for that, for us to deliver on that promise until the end of August was when, that was the first time that she had a school. So she went, that entire time without having any school, which was tremendously difficult. Sounds like an understatement. But that was the conversation that we had with her. My younger one is in second grade now. So he's, a second grader and an eighth grader are, obviously in very different places. And with him, we started driving by the school where we knew he was going to end up going to and saying, oh, look, there's the elementary school that your siblings went to. Wasn't that a great school? They loved that school. They really liked it a lot. And then he started saying, I want to go to that school. And we were like, we'll see. Well, let's look into it. Are you sure? Yeah. I want to go to that school. That's a great school. And we're like, yeah, it's a lot closer to our house and you'd have friends in the neighborhood. And like, we kind of got him sold through the back door. So he actually is not aware. My daughter knows very much that she was saying like, how come I can't go back there? I want to go back there. And she's aware that she just can't. But my son, it's bizarre, little kids, like we were just like, okay, we're jumping on this. Yep. Let's have you go to this other school. So that worked for him.
Right.
I don't know if that's like, listen, I don't know if that's ideal or not. I do. I think they're two very different situations. Honestly, I'm like really interested to see how it pans out in terms of their relationship to the Jewish community, right? Like that's my biggest fear is that these kids know that they can't be there, like that they can't be in the schools that they want to be in. They can't be a part of the community. And like, how do I tell them? How do I tell them you can't, you're not allowed to go to this school, to this camp? Like I am dodging that, right or wrong. I don't know if this is best practice, but I am dodging until like maybe I can find someplace for them to go. It's not totally honest, but it feels like it's what's hopefully best for them until maybe we can find someplace that will bring them in.
Right. Well, I certainly don't have an answer to that question of whether it's best practice or not, but it's certainly a decision which you seem to have made with a tremendous amount of care and thoughtful consideration about your kids' needs, which is obviously so important that they know that no matter what, their parents are on their side. And I think ultimately, my guess would be that their feeling about the Jewish community is going to come a lot from their sense of their parents who care so much about the Jewish community, having cared so much about them, because most of kids' messages about things like that come from their parents. If we could just go to that last question, Stephanie, and think about how can talking about these difficult, topics with, younger kids, how can that be done, and what are some areas of difficulty and some areas of focus in those conversations?
Yeah. So I don't think it's about talking about, self-harm and cutting in kindergarten, right? And that might not, you might not talk about self-harm explicitly like that until 7th or 8th grade, right? I mean, that it has to happen before high school, right? But there are concepts that you have to start with in preschool and spiral, just like the way you have spiraling curriculum for math and for everything else, you need to have that for healthy living. And for even just fundamental things like noticing that you're not regulated or that your friend isn't, and understanding what a troublesome thought is and noticing it, or when you hear a troublesome thought, right? So I think We built a middle school. We opened a middle school last year, and we spent a year in a design thinking process to do that. And one of the things I did was visit a lot of high schools and talk to guidance counselors and say, what do you wish your kids had come in already knowing? And I had anticipated that it was going to be like concrete sort of facts, and what I heard from people was like wanting kids to have basic understanding of concepts that could keep evolve. So like understanding what consent is something that you can talk about, and you do in preschool, and you have to talk about every year. And every year, the circumstances where consent is going to become a real issue are going to look different as a child grows. I think it's the same thing with things like understanding your emotions and understanding healthy eating, like all of those things, right? These should be spiraling curricula. I noticed something. I haven't been in education for very long. I started my career in Teach for America for a couple of years, and I was an attorney and had a winding road. So I've only been in education, back in education for the past 4 years, running Beit Rabban. And something that I like sort of noticed really quickly, because I was hired in part to open this middle school. We have this amazing preschool and my elementary school was, preschool education is all about the fundamentals of how to live, how to care for yourself, how to interact with other human beings, right? And then this thing happens where you have very specific benchmarks you have to achieve in all these different areas of collecting knowledge, right? And it becomes really hard to continue those conversations. But the thing is that it does not make sense to stop them, right? It doesn't make sense to stop them there because your growth and your development does not stop when you go into kindergarten. And in fact, what I noticed when I was looking at a lot of different, in building something new, you read so many, you have the blessing of like seeing what everyone else has done, right? That as kids get older, the amount of time that they have for that kind of conversation, for that emotional development, for the free play where you learn to navigate, right? It gets more and more constricted, where kids sometimes don't have recess, and all of that's interconnected, and they need it the whole way through. And I would say they need it most probably in preschool and in middle school, just because of those are the times where you're developing at rapid pace, right? Emotionally and otherwise. So I think you build it in and it's spiraling. You and I talked a little bit, Noam, about a search I was on for a healthy living curriculum that spiraled from kindergarten through middle school. And I was hoping that, I assumed, frankly, that, Jewish education has been around for a while, but I didn't know what existed, and I would find a really awesome Jewish values-based healthy living curriculum that covered physical health and wellness, that covered emotional and mental health and wellness, that covered sexual health and wellness, right? And I did not find that. And that was, that covered digital citizenship, all those areas. That I did not find that. I did find a couple of things geared towards pieces of that, or older, like, some really good curriculum on sexual health and wellness and relationships with a Jewish lens for middle school, for high school. But all those things, you just cannot have a kid start to have those conversations when their realities are already in conversation with these issues. So anyways, we put something into place that I like a lot in middle school. Pieces of digital citizenship and nutritional physical health and mental and emotional health and sexual health and wellness. And we had meant to start something in kindergarten, but then the pandemic. So we didn't launch it this year, but I hope we will next year. And yeah.
Okay, I think that point that you made, and I'll kind of take this point and try and drive us to the close, because I know it's getting late. But I think that point that you made about the need to start talking early about the fundamentals of the same kind of issues that ultimately, culminate in exhibiting themselves in different ways when kids are older is so important and so in line with what we're really saying communally as well, right? Which is that we can't start having certain difficult conversations when something really difficult shows up. We need to start having them earlier so that we have the internal resources, so that the relationships have been created, so that the institutional pieces have been put into place, so that when something difficult happens, there is a way in which we can manage that. So that's true for a child's inner psyche, that they can't first start talking about sexuality, let's say, when they've never talked about body at all, right? They need to understand their body and think about their body, and those kind. And then there are certain aspects of body, whether that they can then get into in more detail. And the same thing with their emotions. They need to have those, this is what it looks like when you're sad, and this is what it looks like when you're happy conversations, and conversations about difficult emotions, to be able to then say, oh, and when emotions become so difficult that you can't handle them on your own, what do you do then? And it's true about us institutionally as well. We need to be able to have these kinds of conversations in advance, so that we can, then take them and put the pieces into place, and so that people are ready to hear them. And I think that's, really what's so great about what's come out of what Carrie has done with her experience, right, is push us as a community to be having more of these conversations in advance, so that, ultimately the next child and the child after that, who has any kind of difficulty, is in an environment that's more ready to help that child and to, keep them welcome within the community. So I know that's something that we at Refuat HaNefesh are interested in, keeping to push that agenda. And it's really encouraging to me to hear, from another educator in a different school, that it's something which is on their agenda at Beit Rabban. And I know I have colleagues around the country for whom that's true as well. And, to hear that a parent who had a difficult time and ultimately was, put in a position to leave the community for her children in that way, is so invested in staying involved in the community and helping us grow and become better at a community, is just a tremendous, tremendous thing. So I thank you both so much for your time tonight. I apologize to those people who put in questions that we couldn't get to, but I think there'll be hopefully more forums in the future for us to continue these conversations. And hopefully we'll all continue working to make our community a little bit more open, a little bit more welcoming, and a little bit more accepting and available for every single member of our community, regardless of what's going on with them. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Noam.
Thank you so much. Thanks,
Okay,
Deb.
and have a great night, everybody, and continued success and blessings for everyone. Be well.
Thank you.